Well, greetings in Christ. This is Michael Beasley with the Armory Ministries, and it has been years since I have produced anything, whether by video or audio, for the podcast, and that's been of necessity because of my time constraints. In 2014, I went from being just a pastor to being a bivocational pastor of necessity. And things changed for me. I had to change the structure of my time, and that modified what I was able to do and not do. And what I'd like to do in this brief video, and it will need to be brief, is to address the recent and unfortunate conflict between Brannon Howse and James White. Obviously, I'm not addressing this because I have any immediate connection with this matter, but indirectly, I do have some connection with it by virtue of the fact that a few years ago, in fact, about the time that I was contemplating having to become bivocational, I was, for a brief moment, contributing to Brannon Howse's website. In fact, this is why I'm actually making this public statement. Brannon had interviewed me a couple of times on his radio program, and he had offered for me to become a contributor. For a brief time, I started supplying podcasts to him, and tentatively there were plans set up for me to come out and do a video series for the Armory Ministries on the subject of the family, and that's something that I was actually really looking forward to doing. I had already been doing some background work on that in preparation for that. Had already done a lot of work in the past, and was looking forward to condensing some of the material that I had for that into a video series. All that stopped and changed when I had to become bivocational. That was the principal reason why I bowed out of Worldview Weekend and my connection with Brannon in that sense. I will say that as I was thinking through whether or not to do this, and as it is the case whenever you're considering this idea of partnering with another individual that you may not know all that well, I did have some reservations and questions in my mind about the nature of Brannon's ministry, and actually this will come out in a portion of a program that I'm going to play here in a moment. But there were things that I was thinking through and wondering about. Nothing worthy of stopping and saying anything, because it was just a question in my mind. But in one of the programs, I did address a concern that I had about the nature in which we address the issue of polemics. We'll get to that in a moment, and this is really the main reason why I'm producing this video. But the thing I'd like to begin with here is really a broader consideration of a principle that we've been going through as a church, and it has to do with our series on the book of James. And in James chapter 3 going on to chapter 4, James gives us a very important contrast between true wisdom and false wisdom. And to summarize what he's teaching here, what he does is he helps us to think through the fact that God's wisdom is, as he says, is first pure, then peaceable. And he goes through the list of the description. He says that the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, he says, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering without hypocrisy. And then he says, and the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. In a sense, he's calling upon believers to think through this matter of being peacemakers, but peacemakers in the manner of true peace, not false peace. The world's version of peace oftentimes incorporates compromise, ungodly compromise. If you think about the idea of being a peacemaker, think through what Jesus taught regarding peacemakers. He says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Now, if we just stop there, we would maybe think through the idea of being a peacemaker and maybe fail to understand the point. Being a peacemaker doesn't mean you're going to have no conflict. In fact, if you read on in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus then goes on to say, "Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness." for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men cast insults at you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. When James talks about being a peacemaker in James 3, he's not talking about this idea of pursuing compromising peace. He's talking about true peace. Peace which does not have compromise. And the thing that he's helping us to think through is the fact that if we're finding ourselves in the middle of conflicts, we have to ask the question, why are we in the middle of a battle or a war? It better be for true peace. It better be for true wisdom. It better be that we're laboring as true peacemakers, such that if we suffer persecution, it's for Christ's sake, not because of our own selfish pleasures. So he then goes on to talk about the quarrels and conflicts that were taking place amidst the believers to whom he was writing. So in the 4th chapter, and this is one of the reasons why I think chapter divisions can get in the way, but he's still talking about the difference between genuine peace and genuine wisdom versus false wisdom, which produces conflicts and selfishness and so forth, which is what he's already indicated in the prior chapter. So he says, what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. And you are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. Twice he uses the word, and my translation has the word pleasures. The word here is hedone, hedonism. We get the word hedonism from this word. The idea here is that with hedonism is that it's all about you. Your desires, your own selfish desires, are the only things that you're thinking about and considering. When we are engaged in that selfish hedonism, and that's redundant because hedonism is selfish, it's a very concept and connotation of the word. When we're that way, we will find ourselves in the midst of quarrels and conflicts, not for righteousness' sake, not because we're suffering as true peacemakers who are seeking the will of God and the wisdom of God, but rather we'll find ourselves in the middle of polemics. And I use that word polemics because the word that he uses here in verse 1 of chapter 4, quarrels, that word literally is polemi. We get the word polemics from this Greek word. War is literally what is meant there. And what he's saying is, if you find yourself in the middle of a conflict, a war, if it's not for the sake of genuine truth, genuine wisdom, then it can only be something else, and that only other thing can be your own selfish desires. This is important because when you think about it, whenever we are in the middle of a conflict, it really becomes a moment when we need to stop and think about why. Why am I in the middle of a conflict? Is it really because I'm defending truth and upholding the wisdom from above? Or am I serving myself, and therefore the conflict that I'm in the middle of is really the result of my own foolishness and sin? Brethren, this is a question that every believer needs to think through. None of us are above it. None of us are immune to these problems that James is addressing. And I want to address here in this video some of the concerns that I've had regarding Brannon and some of the things that he has done. And I should say this, that in my effort to reach out to him and write a letter to him, I have found that his response has been pretty short. He offered one email response to a letter that I wrote to him, and since then, after subsequent efforts to contact him, all that he's done is just shut me out. I was a little surprised to see that he blocked me on Twitter. Certainly not the end of the world. By the way, as a bivocational pastor, I don't have much time for social media, which I think is a blessing in disguise anymore. But my efforts to communicate with him have been rather limited. I will say that at the beginning there was a concern regarding some of the individuals that Brannon had interviewed, and some of the individuals had charged James White of being a heretic. And I wanted to address that with Brannon in order to really start with the most obvious thing. There were other concerns I wanted to address, but I wanted to begin with the most obvious, what I felt was the most obvious problem, that you would have individuals on your program charging James White with heresy for his Yasser Qadi dialogue. And so one of the things that I said in that letter is this, that the charges against James White that I've heard coming through some of your recent Worldview Weekend interviews have been remarkably unsubstantiated and personally destructive. If it could be demonstrated that he has abandoned the Christian faith or has entered the realm of heresy or apostasy, then that would be one thing. However, having listened to several of your programs on this matter, I am dumbfounded as to why White should be treated in such an extreme fashion. What I was addressing again was the fact that there was one program in particular that where White was accused of being a heretic, and Brannon did not make this charge. Others did, and I'm sorry I cannot reproduce the names of the individuals off the top of my memory at this point, but there were two who did this, and Brannon did not rebuff that. So in my letter to Brannon, I made an appeal to him, again, working with what I thought was a more obvious issue first. I just addressed that with him. Now, to his credit, he responded by indicating that he wished that he had rebuffed that or distanced himself from those comments in that interview. And I believe it was the next day in which Brannon actually posted a statement where he indicated that that was not his position. He was not arguing that James White was a heretic or an apostate. However, that being one thing, that being probably the most extreme matter, the battle has still continued. And the manner in which this has taken place and the way in which Brannon has responded has been a point of concern for me. And it does verify some of the internal thoughts and curiosities that I had about Brannon and the nature in which he addresses polemical issues. This video that I'll show here shows the way in which he has responded to individuals who have sought to write to him. Not just myself, there have been others who have been writing to him, even current contributors or individuals who are contributors at the time that they were communicating with him. This video showcases really the nature of Brannon's response to these individuals who are trying to reach out to him to appeal for self-restraint and wisdom in dealing with this matter. Here, look at this video.
You now have Americans defending Islam because they don't want to be seen as a hater. They don't want to be seen as a bigot. They want to go along with the group consensus. They don't want to be a troublemaker. They don't want to be persecuted. So what do? They now defend Islam. This is how you destroy a country from within. And folks, sadly, again, even conservative evangelical folks are coming out and saying, well, I don't think what James White did with that jihadi imam in that interfaith dialogue in Memphis, my town, is a problem. I don't think it's unbiblical. Again, would you have expected that from Phil Johnson, the executive director of Grace to You of John MacArthur? No, absolutely not. From a mainline church, a liberal church? Yeah. This, again, shows us how late the hour is, how uneducated people are, how many of these people are, I believe, intellectual simpletons. They don't understand the issues. They are, unfortunately, really doing great damage, I believe, to the true church, whether they know it or not or intend to or not. And it's just very, very serious. And it's so serious that we've even got some folks that have been on our network that have been defending this because they're friends of James White, and we just cut some of them loose today because we are not going to have a network of people that cannot stand for truth. We're not a network that can be bought. We cannot be intimidated. We're not part of a good old boy club. You have built your audience the same way we have, being independent broadcasters. And if some of the broadcasters we carry on our network want to be friends with James White and defend what he has done, well, it's the undefendable. And if they cannot get in line with what is right, We will not permit them to harangue us, to intimidate us, to email us, to text us, to call us for weeks on end, as they've done, trying to get us to be quiet because this is their friend. I'm sorry. We cannot be bought. So we booted a few of them today, and let the word go forth. I will not sit down and give this country over to the Muslim Brotherhood that has killed 5 million Jews, 6 million non-Jews, I believe, by helping Hitler and the final solution through al-Banna, the founder of Muslim Brotherhood, and the Grand Mufti of Israel, al-Husseini, who got over 10,000 Bosnian Muslims and other Muslims to wear the Nazi uniform, including the swastika and the crescent moon and sword. I will not sit down for this. If I end up being the only program on my own network, so be it. I will not be intimidated. I will not be bought.
I believe that this video demonstrates the matter that I'm talking about in terms of the concern over how one engages in a polemical contest with another, especially a brother in Christ. This idea of just kicking out men and individuals that he had identified as being those who are not upholding the truth, that's a strong charge. And in light of this, I ended up writing to Brannon a follow-up note to my original email to him. And I indicated the following, and I'm going to go ahead and read this. I said, this past week, I was exposed to several statements given by you that I have difficulty reconciling, but I hope to gain some understanding with your help. On the Hagman report, you indicated that a few Worldview Weekend contributors had been booted from the network. This you stated in the context of indicating concern regarding those who would not make a stand for truth, in addition to other expressed concerns. Because of this, many have wondered, as did I, if you were referring to Mike Abendroth and Justin Peters. Of course, apart from the issuance of names during the Hagman Report interview, no one can really know for certain. Then, in a more cordial post on Facebook, you indicated that it was time to say goodbye to Mike and Justin, saying that it was sad to say goodbye to old friends and that you would miss them greatly. I must admit that I'm confused by this, especially if you were referencing Mike and Justin on the Hagman Report interview. I am not alone in this point. However, if you were referring to others, then why not name them, especially if they're so steeped in error as you suggested? If this matter is as grave and important as you continue to argue, why would you withhold the identities of such individuals from Christ's body? Brannon, I have great concern over the manner in which this whole matter has degraded, especially since the opportunity to discuss genuine concerns with James White seems to have been engulfed in an ocean of internet histrionics, the likes of which have come from multiple ends. I would only repeat my encouragement to you to have a mediated discussion with James White via Mike Abendroth or someone else who can and will do it. This would be the best pathway forward for two brethren to work out their differences in a respectful collegial discussion. Regretfully, if this will not be your intended pathway forward, I would respectfully ask that you would remove my profile page from your website. I again encourage you to feel free to write or call. Now, this was my last appeal to Brannon, and it was met with no response other than the fact that he fulfilled my request of removing my profile page from his website. And this really brings me to the principal concern that I had, and this really brings me back to some of the questions that I had a few years ago when I was contemplating becoming more involved in the Worldview Weekend program. This idea of having a disagreement with a brother in Christ and not engaging in a collegial and respectful debate and dialogue, but rather just shutting down the individual, shutting down the opponent, and finding oneself in the middle of a conflict, but really not one that's producing a resolve, is a problem. And this is why I wanted to play a segment of a program in which it was in 2014 that Brannon interviewed me. And he was interviewing me in view of an article that I had written regarding Kirk Cameron. And Kirk Cameron was at the time, he was promoting a movie that he had made. And he had a number of interviews whereby he was promoting his video. And in one particular video with Father David Dwyer, it was somewhat troubling because he was talking to Father David Dwyer as if Dave Dwyer was a believer and as if he was a fellow Christian and believed in and proclaimed the very gospel that we believe and proclaim. And if anyone has ever bothered to listen to the programs of David Dwyer, I think that they would understand that David Dwyer is a classic Catholic in the sense that he believes the classic and traditional doctrines of Roman Catholicism. And it's quite apparent to me, and if you read the article in my open letter to Kirk Cameron, I think it's pretty apparent that Dave Dwyer needs the gospel. The concern that I had is that Kirk Cameron, for the sake of promoting a movie, had whitewashed the distinction. And though it may not have been intended or some explicit motive of his to do so, it was problematic, I believed. But the manner in which I addressed that issue, I believe, was something that I needed to think through carefully, pray through carefully. And it's something that I wanted to talk to Brannon about in that program, whereby we would think about the nature in which we engage in any kind of a polemic. And so what I did was I prefaced my comments with some principles that I believe that are crucial, actually very foundational, and I think would be very helpful if we really thought through them, especially in light of this conflict between Brannon and James White. I'm going to play that audio here, and I want you to think about the principles of 2 Corinthians chapter 10. I first reference chapter 11, but then go to chapter 10 and talk about it in this program. Give this a listen.
Before even mentioning the letter itself, if I could just contextualize the letter, and I think that this is somewhat of an important matter of context that people should be mindful of. Whenever we're addressing and expressing concern about another man and his teaching or his influence or his theology, a proper perspective needs to be in place. Paul, when he's writing to the church at Corinth, clearly he had many things and issues that he had to address. He writes to them in the 11th chapter of 2 Corinthians, and he expressed concern over the fact that they were being led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. Then he says this, "For if one comes and preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or you receive a different spirit which you have not received, or a different gospel which you have not accepted," he says, "you bear this beautifully." So clearly there was a problem and an issue there in terms of their losing grip of their simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. If you go back to the prior chapter, Paul describes the mechanism of his approach to this. And he says this concerning the false structures of thinking that were in existence in the church and throughout the world. He says that having powerful weapons for this warfare that are not of the flesh, but are divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses, he says in the 4th verse of chapter 10. He then moves on to verse 5, and he says, "We are destroying speculations, logismus," this idea of human reasoning, human philosophies, and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So Paul is saying, you need to understand, we are here for a search and destroy mission, basically. He's saying we're tearing down these structures, these fortresses of false thinking that are raised up against the knowledge of God. But then using that same word for destruction, he then says in verse 8, he says that, even though I should boast somewhat further about our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up, and not for destroying you, I shall not be put to shame. The distinction is important. Paul was not trying to destroy people, but he was looking to take down the structures of false thinking. And I do believe that the discussion surrounding Kirk Cameron, and not just him, but Dave Dwyer, Glenn Beck, this really should be seen as an opportunity, a gospel opportunity for the church to take down the false structures of false thinking, at the same time building up brethren in the process. That's the objective of the letter. That's the point of it. and that was really the point of your interview, I know, with Justin Peters. And so I think that's just very important to underscore that for people so that they would understand we should learn from these experiences, all of us. And if we can do that, then that's a great benefit.
Absolutely. Well, again, David Dreyer would be Father David Dreyer. He is the host of...
In that interview and in that premise to my statement that I gave in the interview, I ran through the principle of 2 Corinthians chapter 10 rather quickly. Didn't have a whole lot of time, needed to fit it in quickly. But I hope the point is clear because this is very important. There is a difference between destroying false ideas, destroying speculations, and anything that is raised up against the knowledge of God. There is a profound difference between that and this idea of destroying people, where the polemic gets personal, and it's no longer designed to build up rather than destroy. It's no longer designed to build up the brethren and uphold the truth and uphold wisdom, but now it's a matter of just destroying others, really for selfish purposes. That is a profound difference, and it's one of the reasons why I believe that any individual, any person who's going to engage in some sort of a polemical contest, that they would engage in this matter of praying and thinking through what it is that they're going to say and do in that process, and thinking through their motives and thinking about whether or not they're really upholding truth or whether or not they're really looking to destroy their opponent. In my original letter to Brannon, I said the following, and I wanted to also include this. Forgive the split infinitive there. The following, I said this, I said the responsibility of issuing reproof to others must never be taken lightly. Such a duty can either yield great good or harm, depending on the wisdom or lack thereof of the person issuing such a rebuke. At its best, it is an opportunity to seek growth and sanctification within Christ's body, especially when it is approached with a humble view to oneself, Galatians 6:1b, before addressing others, Galatians 6:1a. Such an endeavor must be prayerfully sought out in love, Ephesians 4:16, with a hatred for falsehood, Ephesians 4:25a, and a commitment to truth, Ephesians 4:25b, while holding a high esteem for the people of God, Ephesians 4:25c. In this age of the internet, the lack of personal contact, confrontation, often serves to degrade our mindfulness of these principles. But it should not be this way. The issuance of reproof is no trivial task, and should give anyone serious pause before giving any form of a corrective to others. When armed with these principles, we can join Paul in this matter of destroying the fortresses of false doctrine as a means of building up God's people, not destroying them. And so this is a theme and a thought that I have repeated to Brannon now. I offered it to him back in 2014. At the time, it was, again, a more of a tentative thought and concern. But now, more explicitly, I wanted to communicate this to him and remind him of the very things that I shared with him back then. Again, when I shared that with him in 2014, I didn't have a specific issue that I was particularly concerned about. There wasn't a particular thing that Brannon was doing that I thought that I needed to bring that up as a point of confrontation or rebuke or whatever. And if I thought that that was necessary, I would have communicated that to him privately. But I shared that principle back in 2014 as a way of offering a universal reminder to myself and to all others hearing that when we engage in this process of criticizing another, we need to do so based upon the wisdom that is from above, the wisdom of God. If not, we're going to be engaged in our own selfish pleasures, which will only produce war and conflicts that are not God-glorifying, but they are actually that which exalt the flesh. So, as I said, this video needs to be brief, and I have time constraints and many things to take care of today. But I offer this to the general public. I offer this as a statement. I offer this as a way, hopefully, to build up the body of Christ and to learn from what's taking place. As I was talking to my family and my children about this whole issue and just saying to them that, listen, we all need to take heed unto ourselves. We need to think through this matter whenever we see examples in the public view that are not to be followed. We first need to look at ourselves and say to ourselves, how can I be a better believer and a more responsible believer as I look at this issue, and how is it that I fall short in the same way? As James says at the beginning of chapter 3, we all stumble in many ways. And then he goes on and proceeds to talk about the tongue and what a troubling thing it is, such a small fire that can set an entire forest ablaze. It's this idea of thinking about the potential for damage and danger that we have with our own foolishness and our own sin that we have to contemplate and consider every time. Whenever we say something, we need to think about our motives. We need to think about whether or not our words are giving edification according to the need of the moment, as Paul says in Ephesians 4. Because the bottom line is that we're either going to be building up the brethren in true wisdom, or we're going to be doing something very, very different. And so this is for me. This is for everyone. And my appeal to Brannon, I'm not saying anything different to you now than I was then. And the invitation that I gave to you in my follow-up note, I want to repeat. What I said is that I recently spoke with Mike Abendroth about his offer to moderate discussion between you and White. I would strongly encourage this. It would set forth a far better example of biblical confrontation, Galatians 2:14, for God's glory, the edification of his people, and the preservation of our gospel witness. And so that statement that I gave to Brannon, I wish to repeat. That's the point of this video. I'm not trying to belittle people. What I'm doing is I'm addressing what is now not just a public issue, but it is now a public issue that is a derogation of the gospel witness that we have as believers, and it is something that needs to have godly reconciliation. So, Brannon, reconsider this matter. Have a discussion with James White. You recently talked about the importance of courage and the dangers of fearing men on one of your programs. Good words. And what a great demonstration of such boldness in Christ that it would be for you to have a public discussion with James White. You have made this public. I'm no stranger to polemics. I've written a number of polemical books. And the polemical books that I have written, I have given the manuscripts of those books to the individuals that I was critiquing or analyzing. Why? Because I wanted them to have the chance to review and analyze what I was saying before I went public with the manuscript. I also wanted to see if there was any hope for them to change their thoughts in the process. But I only went public with the manuscript after I gave it that effort to try to reach out to those individuals. Because of the gravity of this issue, because of the gravity that you're claiming that this issue has, I believe that it behooves you then to engage in such dialogue and to do so for the greater good and glory of God. So that's my appeal. That's also my encouragement for everyone who's been observing this issue, for those who listen to Brannon and either feel that he's doing things well, or those of you who are criticizing him. All these principles are for everybody. And so that's why I call it a universal appeal. It's for me, it's for all of us. So again, may God work through this, and may he be glorified in his church. Until next time, and I don't know when it will be, when I'll have another video, I do want to address other issues regarding the question of what apologetics is, or what we mean when we talk about apologetics in the Bible. So I do want to say a few more things about this issue and hope to have another video speaking more to the issue of the Yasser Qadi dialogue. But that'll be for another time. Until then, Godspeed.